Good afternoon, everyone, in person and online. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this year's annual adoption lecture, Dr. Tam Cane. She will be presenting her research on the AFDiT framework, which she has co-developed with adoptees, adopted parents and birth parents with experience of transracial adoption, with the aim to improve social work practice in transracial adoption and enhance long-term identity outcomes for transracially adopted children. Dr. Cane is an Associate Professor of Social Work at the University of Sussex, where her primary research interests include adoption and transracial adoption, anti-racist practice in social work and reproductive health. She has a professional background in social work, including court proceedings and adoption, and she serves as an expert panel member on adoption panels. Dr. Cane has developed two innovative practice frameworks aimed at improving adoption and fostering practices. As well as the AFDiT framework, she has also developed the BRACED model to address racial disparities in adoption recruitment and assessment of prospective adopters, which is used in adoptive practice to support debiasing and decision-making. Dr. Cane is widely recognised for her leadership in anti-racist adoption research across academia, adoption services, and the broader social work community. Her work has been recognised at the University of Sussex Research with Impact Awards, ranking in the top 1% and receiving finalist and exceptional research recognition. And recently, she received a Zimbabwe Achievers Award for her contributions to social work and research in the UK. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Tam Cane.
Thank you very much. I've got so many mics here, so I've got no idea which one to use, but I'll follow instructions. I'll try and do that. So thank you so much for the invitation to come to Wales Exchange and, of course, the Cascade as well. Here at Cardiff. So all the time, I was mentioning to Amy that all the time I cross the bridge, I feel at home. So when I moved to the UK, my first home was in Swansea. And then I also worked at Newport Talbot as well some years ago. So actually Wales is not a stranger to me. So thank you so much for inviting me back here. And it's such a lovely welcome. And thank you so much for that introduction, Amy. So what I would like to do is to share with you the AFDiT framework. And I think, Amy, you've already highlighted some brief around how it was formulated. But what I would like to do, I suppose, is to give you a brief background of the research that led to the development of the AFDiT framework, and then how it's being implemented in practice across England, and then to think about the impact of transracial adoption when it's not done right to children of racialized and minoritized ethnic groups. And as we carry on the conversations, I would like us to think about how can this be applied to the Welsh context. So thank you, Catherine, for highlighting that, because actually it allows us to think about some of our children here, particularly who may be adopted across the bridge, and perhaps maybe in adoptive and fostering homes actually that are not necessarily Welsh. So we can think about how AFDiT can be applied in that sense. As much as I can, and from my reading, rather than the research I've carried out in this way, I think it's important to put that caveat, because I'm not a Welsh researcher in that context, mainly in England. So maybe we can help each other in discussions later on. So just as we start, I think it's important to think about the historical context of transracial adoption. And we know that going back to the 1960s, it was really thinking about what do we need to do in terms of supporting permanency for Black children. So the research we've carried out was mainly, when I thought about this research, it was about what do we need to do about Black children in care in terms of their identity, in terms of their belonging. And we're looking historically, and we know that there's a history around Black children in care, Black children being adopted. And yes, it was common going back to the 1960s. And moving forward, there was that understanding, I would argue, that love is enough, provide a home for a child, identity not necessarily considered, and thinking about belonging for those children, particularly when adopted in white families. Then moving forward, we begin to see some concerns around identity outcomes for Black children who are adopted in particularly white families. So we know that some of those concerns were emerging from America, where there were some campaigns around actually Black children do not belong in white homes because of concerns around cultural genocide. Probably a term that is difficult to kind of capture and acknowledge because we know that there's genocide elsewhere, but here it's in the context of culture and cultural erasure. The legislation we know that is also applicable here in Wales, thinking about the Children Act 2002, reminded us that we need to take due consideration of race, ethnicity, and culture in social work to support issues around identity that were raised of concern. But legislation didn't provide clear guidance on how that could be done. And then there were concerns again that continued around what does that mean in terms of support for identity and culture. So again, because of those concerns, legislation was changed. 2014, due consideration of race and ethnicity was removed from legislation, again, without clear guidance. So of course, I think if we look at research, we know that there's this up and down around what is right for Black children and Asian children and mixed identity children within fostering and adoption. So that back and forth has always been there. But we're still in a situation where thinking about the impact of transracial adoption, the concerns remain, particularly around race trauma, which I'll talk about as we carry on in the talk today. So then we think about ethnic disparities. And here I'm speaking based on the English context. And what we know, if we look back in 2014, we know that about 83,630 children were in care. And if we think about the statistics around that, 11% were mixed ethnicity, and 5% Asian, 7% Black, and 5% other ethnic minorities. What we then have, though, is that we've got 82% of white foster carers compared to just 18% of foster carers of Black and Asian minorities. If we compare that to the 25% of children in care who are of those backgrounds, Black and Asian backgrounds, we know that we don't have enough foster carers in the system. And if we then want to think about children who are adopted, we know that there's 84% of children who are adopted of white backgrounds. And within the statistics, we know 2% are Black and 1% are Asian. We also know that mixed race children are adoptable because of their mixed identities. So when you then want to compare with Black children, we know they remain much longer in the system. Part of the concern is that we've got 6% of children who need adoption compared to a very small percentage of 2% who are adopted parents of Asian and Black backgrounds. What we know then from our statistics is that Black children remain longer in care. When you add disability, when you add siblings, they become opportunities for adoption become slimmer and slimmer. And for those children, then they experience numerous placements. And the impact of numerous placements is significant in terms of permanency, stability, belonging, and of course, connections with their heritage, which I will again touch on later on. So if we then want to think about the dominant narratives of transracial adoption experiences, just thinking about this context here in the UK and also internationally, we know from research that there are concerns around the oversimplification of identity in respect to the cohort that we're thinking about in this research, in this work. So Black, Asian, and minoritized identities being simplified, lack of understanding around identity. Then there's been concerns around color blindness. So for example, love is enough. We don't need to address race. We don't need to address ethnicity. Love is going to fix everything. It's going to fix issues around neglect, issues around behavior, but not necessarily consideration around the impact of identity that might be affected in relation to birth culture and also in relation to their heritage and issues around language, for example. So we also know from research that there's concerns about racial identity silencing. I think I want to think about racial silencing, both for Black children, mixed race children, but in particular, we're hearing more and more about Roma Gypsy traveler children as well, because of the stigmatization around their culture and heritage as well. So what we're finding is that children are being raised both in fostering and in adoption without necessarily understanding their true heritage, for example. Then we also know that there's some concerns around tokenistic, racial, ethnic, and cultural socialization, not necessarily supporting children really to understand their cultures, or adopted parents perhaps not necessarily integrating well in children's cultural spaces, for example, to support them with issues around identity, belonging, and integration. So this minimization of the importance of heritage, you see it quite often and frequently throughout research around adoption, and these concerns around gratitude, which we know generally within adoption, but when you then add the element of race and identity, it adds additional concerns. Then we also know there are concerns around saviorism, particularly in regards to where children might be adopted. And if you look at research, there's also additional research that talks about fetishization of children who are Black or Asian and the concerns around that. Samuels here talks about the impact of epistemic trauma. And we still here, I'll talk about some of the findings later on, but I think that concern remains till today, where children are being raised, perhaps in a family where they don't understand their identity, the narratives around their adoption story, perhaps being not necessarily being provided with its true nature and accuracy and the concerns around that. So whose knowledge is it in regards to their identity, and who does it belong to, and meanings around that, and the impact it does have on the healing process for those children. So we also know that because of these concerns, it's causing identity confusion for children who don't necessarily understand their history in relation to their adoption story, in relation to their heritage, in relation to their race and ethnicity. So in addition to that, if we think about the placement moves, it's causing concerns in relation to the fluctuation of ethnic identity, fluctuation of understanding identity, and what we understand from research that was done by Saria at Coventry, which talks about identity seesaw and the flux of identity that changes when children move from placement to placement, not necessarily because children are choosing to change their identities or understanding of their ethnicity, but because this is something that has been contributed to by our care system. Because if we think about children who are moved straight from foster care or maybe from their families, it might be that they're going to a placement that is available at the time, no consideration about matching, then they move again, and throughout that journey, children are exposed to different cultures, different languages, different ethnicities, and the impact of that on their identity, which might affect how they understand who they are. So in addition to this, the idea of racialized trauma, which is linked to identity erasure, lack of understanding of one's identity, racial identity, but also being exposed to microaggressions and racism and discrimination that is not necessarily addressed, particularly if adoptive parents are not supported to understand what that looks like and how to challenge that. And of course, children not necessarily being supported or given guidance or taught how to challenge racism and microaggressions. So this then contributes to the challenges around making sense or seeking to heal through the process of understanding their lived experience. So contributing to this idea of invisible pain. So when we think about invisible pain, I think a helpful quotation that I wanted to use here is the one that we can see here from Branco and colleagues, American researchers who also have lived experience of transracial adoption, talking about how it takes waking up from the great sleep to know that one has been robbed. One has been robbed from understanding their racial identity, their adoption story, to understand who they are in terms of ethnicity and race, but also the fact that some of their feelings around questions and confusions about identity have been suppressed and repressed, particularly thinking about who they are. I thought this was a really powerful story. And the question then I have from that is, who has taken those children to this great sleep? And much of that is what Samuels talks about in terms of epistemic trauma in relation to transracial adoption. So what research suggests is that when thinking about transracial adoption, we really need to think about supporting adoptive parents to have a greater commitment to children, as well as a commitment to connection, as well as integration to children's heritage and culture. So it's also thinking about how race and culture are discussed within the family, how identity is negotiated. And we know from research as well that that negotiation of identity comes from the fact that an adoptive family that is adopting transracially is understanding that where a child's identity is different from theirs, the two worlds need to match somewhere. And that also requires a negotiation of a family identity, not just an identity of the child, but also the family identity is changing. So one would argue it becomes an interracial family, if you like. Then Laban talks about the importance of moving away from symbolic elements that might be tokenistic to suggest that, yes, we're celebrating a child's identity, we're celebrating a child's culture, but to get involved in much more emotional connections in relation to the child's identity as well in their ethnic group. I'll talk about that when I introduce the framework later on. So this idea of curated integration that helps us to think about cultivation of connection across difference. And I think this concept has been explained quite beautifully by one of our adoptees, Anthony, who has been involved in some of this work and is a champion around transracial adoption, the idea of cultivation, connection across difference. Yes, there might be differences, but there are some connections, and it's really about supporting and promoting feelings of belonging. So Ban and Curtin also assert the need to move away from passive methods of socialization. So that the adoption system, I suppose, and practitioners, and anyone involved in this work needs to be thinking about how do we support adoptive parents to seek out and to develop and maintain social relationships that relate to the child, but also with their birth family. And I think this links with some of the work that Beth Neal has done in relation to contact and how we're moving now towards an open adoption system where contact is important to support children understanding their heritage and their birth history and feelings of belonging and culture. Then others talk about culture keeping and the importance of adoptive families replicating the education that children who are transracially adopted would have learned within their birth families. A part of that requires teaching and supporting adoptive parents to do this work. Beth Hooks, in her work, talks about culture consumption. I really like this concept, actually, and it's talking about eating the other's culture. So therefore, where families are bringing in difference, it's about actually I'm bringing your culture to my family, and it's about eating it, it's about consuming it, it's about welcoming it. And I suppose it's really thinking about how do we allow the child to feel that sense of belonging and not necessarily saying, we are supporting your integration with this family, but also we're going to be involved in your culture and your social groups as well. And that belongs part of our family. Another Beth family who we've worked with suggests that when adoptive parents adopting transracially, they're not just adopting the child's culture, but they're also adopting the Beth culture. And they're also, she goes further and she argues that they're also adopting Beth parents as well. And that's to do with maintaining contact post-adoption. Okay, so just thinking about some of the work that has contributed to our thinking about transracial adoption. So just drawing on some of the work that we've done, we know that there's systemic barriers that impact on Black and Asian adopters, particularly in the recruitment processes. And that links in with the work that we've done around how do we support social workers to remove the elements of bias when we are assessing prospective adopters from Black and Asian communities, which we've covered in the BRACE model that I developed to support social workers with this work. But we also know that there's systemic barriers around the goalpost changing. Chowdhury talks about in her research about the goalpost changing all the time. when social workers are assessing Black families or Asian families, they get provided with recommendations about what might be needed to move them forward with the assessment process. The next visit, things change. The next visit, things change, and they never reach the point where social workers are saying, yes, you've addressed everything that we've asked you to address. And that, we know from research, contributes to some of the lack of success in the adoption of Black and Asian families. And we know, of course, there might be concerns that might relate to socioeconomic factors around bedrooms, around large families, and some of the concerns around that. But we also know, if we want to think about children's services research, thinking about Claudia Bernard's work and Anna Gupta's work, we know that Black and Asian families as well experience systemic challenges within child protection systems, which might also contribute to the intergenerational challenges for Black and Asian children within the care system. So when you then want to think about this collectively, we see that when we're thinking about racial trauma, which we need to think about in this context, some of these children would have experienced some challenges throughout before they were even born. And that journey carries on for them throughout the fostering system, in adoption and post-adoption. And we also know that, of course, the current situation is that in England, we're struggling with the Adoption Support Fund. So that means the opportunities for support and therapeutic support, particularly for children who might be affected in this way, will be quite significant because that process of healing may be quite slow. Then the research we've also done with social workers to understand their understanding and application of anti-racist practice in social work. And it has been quite common in this work that social workers lack the competence and the confidence to talk about race. This is something that has been difficult for them. And those challenges to talk about race and identity has led to children's identities being unclear. Understanding of historical narratives for some of the families we work with of Black and Asian backgrounds being very ununderstood. So therefore, that has an impact in terms of the work and the support that is provided to families. And actually, it has an impact on the recording of the child's identity, which then affects how the child's narrative is supported moving forward and what needs to be put in place to support them in developing their understanding of their identity. So I've spoken about intergenerational challenges within the system. And if we want to think about this in terms of intersectionality, particularly for Black and Asian families, that is passed on through generations, you might want to think about the challenges they might face in housing, in education, within the social care system, and other services that they might access, and the impact of that and how that might be passed on to the child, particularly while they're also still in the fetus and as they carry on through fostering and adoption. So I spoke about the goalpost changing and how that limits availability of Black adopters in the system now. So now I just want to move on, having covered the background research, to think about the research that led to the AFDiT framework. So this is the research that we carried out. Initially, we wanted to understand from adopted adults their experiences of living in a transracial adoption family. What were your experiences? What are your recommendations in relation to social work practice? Those were some of the questions. So we spoke to over 20 adults who provided their insights and their experiences of that. Then we also spoke with their parents, and we also spoke with adoptive parents to understand their own experiences and their recommendations around this, particularly what do we need to change if we're going to improve identity outcomes of children. So that was the first phase. And the second phase was really drawing on those findings to co-create a framework that was then piloted across, before we piloted, we provided some training to social workers in pilot sites so that they understand the framework that was co-developed. And then we then piloted the framework. From that pilot, as we're piloting it, we're providing consultations to social workers around understanding transracial adoption issues, thinking about some of the concerns and challenges they were facing in practice, and how to apply the framework in practice. And following that, we reviewed the framework based on the feedback that we received, and then there was a national rollout based on the finalized framework that you saw here. So you might not be able to find this framework on the website, the Transracial Adoption Framework website. And now we're in the process of evaluating it, and I'll be able to talk about some of the feedback that we are receiving from the process of evaluation and feedback from practitioners who are using the framework. So now I just want to talk about some of the reflections that practitioners shared with us as part of this research. So most certainly, it was clear through the reflections and feedback from practitioners that there was no race trauma thinking. So we talk about trauma-informed thinking, but the idea of race and race-related trauma was not anything that really featured in their practice and that practitioners understood. Then, of course, the incompetence in conversations about identity, which also mirrors what we had already found out from from our research with all social workers, but this is quite specific in terms of adoption and transracial adoption. Then some significant challenges about very limited detail on identity. A good example is how ethnicity might be recorded as African, full stop, Black African, full stop, Caribbean, full stop, Muslim, full stop. So what does that mean? Those questions, and you're going into a matching meeting, you have a matching profile that mirrors the same in terms of adoptive parents. So what was clear was that there was no clarity around nuance around identity. That would help with the matching process and with supporting adoptive parents to provide what children need in terms of support around identity. So this then links us with the issues and concerns around overlooking identity development process. So social workers saying that we don't really understand the identity process development in relation to race. So we tend to think about generic developmental issues, global delay, but issues around race and issues around identity and culture, and most certainly around religion and what that might mean to children was definitely not part of the thinking in relation to their work. So it was really about how do we do this when we are piloting the framework and in our practice. So some additional concerns and reflections that were raised around focusing on the technicalities of the matching process and looking for a perfect match. So just thinking back, we know that legislation doesn't provide clear guidance. Some local authorities have their own guidance. But sometimes we know that social workers, when they are faced with children who require placement, and the idea that we need to be thinking about matching them in the right placement in terms of race and ethnicity, sometimes the focus on what is the perfect match contributed to delay. So we know that's one of the concerns that led to the repeal of race and ethnicity. But we also know that this is still existing in practice, even though the due consideration has also been removed. Then you've got the flip side, where practitioners are saying, maybe when we find something that is close to a match in terms of race and ethnicity, that's what they have to work with, and that is considered a match, but actually no work was done in relation to the support that is provided around identity and race. So you're finding the concerns in two ways there. So that the absence of complexity into interlocking identities, this is an interesting one, particularly from in relation to interracial families, in relation to mixed identities, Black, British, and African, again, full stop. So without necessarily looking at the family dynamics, particularly where children might have parents of different identities, different heritage, different ethnicities, and maybe these might be recohabited families as well, where there's additional identities in relation to the parents, but also siblings who might have different identities as well, and thinking about what that might mean in relation to support for children who require contact after adoption, and they're adopted in separate households. So the missing connection around psychology and identity was a concern. The one-size-fits-all approach in relation to preparation for adoption. So we know that in terms of preparing for adoption, social workers provide training. There's been training that is provided around transracial adoption, but the understanding that one size fits all will be okay, and maybe not necessarily additional training, post a single training that has been provided to prospective adopters. So just really some thinking around how can the system change and how can it support adoptive parents in the long term, as well as identity development in the long term for some of these children. I think here, dare not to ask is another one, just that really confirms some of the concerns around sometimes identity contributes to a level of discomfort when we're having conversations about this. So therefore, it's better off not to ask if we don't know how to respond. It's better not to ask because we worry about getting it wrong. So that fear of getting wrong led to many social workers thinking better off not engaging in conversations that we don't know how to deal with afterwards. And we also know that this fear of practitioners being accused of being racist, particularly when they ask questions that might be challenging as well. So again, concerns around is contact right, maybe contact might be unsafe, and some of the concerns might relate to actually questions around safety being raised because social workers don't really understand some of those cultures. So just a need of education a little bit more and some clear understanding of where contact is safe and thinking about other means of contact that allows children to remain connected with their identities. So those are practitioner reflections really in terms of what was happening in practice. I think before I move on to adopters' struggle with understanding of the reality of racism, I think it's also important to bring to our discussion some of the concerns that were raised by practitioners that there's an opt-in approach to post-adoption support within the current system. So what that means is that is the service or is it an adoption service or the system itself, it's very difficult for us to then know when adoptive parents don't come to us and say we're seeking help. It's difficult for practitioners to know that actually everything that has been provided in terms of support in the long term has been applied. So those were some of the concerns that were raised. There's no way we can tell that some of the strategies and recommendations we've provided are being implemented and that there are issues around identity concerns. We will only know unless families come to us and seek support. So those are some of the issues that were raised by practitioners and questions about how do we deal with that, especially with an opt-in service. So let's just think about adopters' struggle around understanding the reality of racism. So this is a quotation I just wanted to highlight to us. So we just think about this participant. What they're talking about here is a concern about addressing issues around race. We don't know how to protect her. This is a child that they adopted, a female child. We don't know how to protect her from this world, how to prepare her for what she'll face because of the color of her skin. The truth is, we were never told about race or religion or anything like that, even though we clearly saw like people on the news, but actually discussions around this with the child never really existed. We just wanted it to be like all of us and not to feel different, you know. Maybe we should have meaning we should have spoken about this because now we realize the impact of it now. How do you even begin when you don't know where to start? The world was telling her one thing and we were telling her something different, but there's a disconnect. I think this quotation for me raises quite a number of points, I think, in terms of one, racial consciousness, which we'll talk about later on. Racial consciousness in relation to adoptive parents' own identity and understanding some of the challenges that their daughter was going to experience because of the color of their skin and having consciousness around what that might mean in relation to the reality of racism. Then the disconnection of that reality, that the child being raised to understand what research talks about is that honorary identity that is provided by an adoptive parent in terms of you think about Black children adopted in white families, the honorary whiteness is it's a quotation that is often used in research, particularly by Baden and colleagues. So I'm thinking about you're telling the child one thing about their identity and another when they go out in the community and the society is very different. And when you think about this, I also want to consider some of the reflections that we had about adopted adults thinking about scraping their skin, using lotion to change the color of their skin to become white. And we think about this particular child here, where the concerns were around intersectionality in this quotation here, where adopted parents, and this is a gay couple, who had adopted a child and at the time was 8 months old. And when they were talking to me, they said, we were on a taxi and the taxi driver asked us, where is the mother? So with this, really thinking about the visible difference of children with adopted parents, particularly where they're adopted by, maybe it could be a white family. And we also know actually that Black families are also looking to adopt white children. That is an increasing issue. And if we think about a case in Maidenhead, who went to court to raise some concerns around racism in relation to placing an interest in adopting Asian family and adopting a white child and what that means. So I think increasingly we need to be thinking about intersectionality in terms of gender and in terms of race. What does that mean where there are obvious differences? And in this case, this participant is explaining the concerns around that and how they felt unprepared to deal with that microaggression. Here's another situation I want to check with you, Tam. We went to an Afro hairdresser's to get her hair fixed, as we're not getting it quite right. I think it's important to highlight for this adoptive parent, they had a social network that also included friends who know how to plait black hair. So initially that was considered sufficient to support the child's hair maintenance, but unfortunately, there were some issues with that support network and they felt exhausted and they were not able to carry on. So it meant that they needed to seek out professional help. And unfortunately, between that time and the time they went to the hairdressers, the child's hair was not necessarily maintained well. So unfortunately, the experience in the hairdressers was that the hairdressers wanted to find out, do you really know what you're doing with this hair? For them, they felt it was like a microaggression. And of course, for the hairdressers, it's black hair with this texture needs good maintenance. So his response was, I have a friend helping me with what we need to do, but she gets busy. It's not always easy to keep asking. I feel like we're a burden already. She was quite offish with me and said, it's not good enough. You should have thought about these things properly before adopting a black child. You can't just know these things. And I think there's a lot to unpick in this text. One is the intersectionality. As I mentioned, it was a gay couple in a taxi, and there were questions around identity, and there were questions around how do I respond to this when I'm being questioned about differences, the microaggression towards the child, towards him as well. And then for him, his own experience here in relation to what he deemed as a microaggression. I also think that there's an element here of identity denial, the importance of the right network, the importance of the right resources that enable adoptive parents to access what is important in terms of supporting children to maintain anything to do with their ethnic care, as well as their identity needs. So, and just really thinking about that, it also became very clear in the research that some adoptive parents become very anxious about visible differences. And this is a quotation here that I summarized. And this participant was talking about how they experienced a microaggression from a colleague. And they were talking about how they were interested in adopting a black child, and they were told that you are a black savior. And also they were told a black aligner. So I'm highlighting these things because it's important to think about the impact and concerns around how to address microaggressions, but also readiness to deal with questions around, are you ready to be adopting a child who might have a different ethnic or racial or cultural identity from you? And in this case, in some discussions, there were concerns that it was the social worker who had recommended that match, not necessarily myself. So I think the question there about what we need to think about in practice when thinking about match and being able to determine whether that match is right and whether adoptive parents are certainly prepared to be dealing with some of the challenges and questions that might arise in relation to identity differences. And I just want to move on to the lived reality of racial trauma. So I've got some quotations here that are emerging from people with lived experience of transracial adoption. And this quotation speaks to how this participant hated their looks. So it was like being handed a jigsaw with pieces from two different boxes. My parents couldn't quite see what I saw in the mirror when I looked at myself. I hated my looks, and the worst thing is I did not feel like a real person. So I think this is the internalization and the challenges around identity that this participant was experiencing. Now, it wasn't my responsibility to make the image of our family match my reality. It was their duty to create a new picture. And this participant's lived experience was that they were raised to understand a different identity which was not theirs. And therefore, that disconnection around whom they're seeing in the mirror and what they're being raised to believe they are was very different. And it caused a lot of challenges for them. My parents never experienced racism, so we know from research that when adoptive parents experience racism or experience being a minority, they're likely to be able to empathize with what the child might experience and feel and put the right structures of support in place. For this participant, they were saying my parents had never experienced racism and they had no tools to deal with anything like that. I was getting it all the time and all the time. That's the racism. All they said is ignore it, cry, or walk away. I grew to internalize racism, envy those who could fight for themselves. I always felt isolated, never had the backing from anyone. I didn't have the language for what it was. I was depressed and tired of feeling I didn't belong in a specific space in my mind and my body. I think this is a good example of the links between racism, racialization, and psychological pain. So there's an element of discomfort here. There's an element of internalization of racism. There's an element here of denial and minimization of experiences of the impact of racism that they were experiencing, the silencing that we spoke about earlier on, and microaggression and microinvalidation. So I think if we really want to then think about this, I think this raises a lot of issues in relation to isolation, rejection, invisibility, and also some concerns around cultural rejection. And if you think about, there's some quotations that were included here in the AFDiT framework that provide some strong quotations from one participant who spoke about, I felt rejected in one world, which was the Black world. They also traveled around the world to try and understand their Black identity, but also they tried to go into the white world. They felt rejected. And when they're explaining it, is that I felt rejected by both worlds. And with some explaining, I wasn't white enough, I wasn't Black enough, I didn't really know or understand who I am. All that contributing to feelings of alienation, feelings of fragmentation, and a mismatch between who exactly am I and what does that mean in terms of creating that alignment in terms of visual identity, race, color, and indeed psychological sense of belonging and confidence in their identity. So having raised all these issues and concerns around support, rejection, and issues around disconnection, microaggressions, racism, and the importance of considering the impact of racial trauma, which I would call it when we want to encapsulate all the narratives that have been explained by transracially adopted people in our research. To us, it explains the racial trauma that has been experienced. And we're also clear from research that what is important is to increase the racial consciousness of adoptive parents to understand their own identities, the child's identities, to be able to provide for what they need. So within the framework, we use the concepts, 2 practice models that we included: racial consciousness, race and cultural consciousness, as well as race and cultural intentionality. Those are the frameworks that we used to ground the framework. So I'll just explain them separately. So the racial and cultural consciousness is that which we've spoken about, understanding the differences in identity, but also helping adoptive parents, and I think practitioners as well and ourselves, to understand the privilege that comes with all our identities and racial identities, and being able to understand what that means when a child who requires support or a child who presents with a different identity than theirs, and the power that is associated with that, and the support that needs to be provided, particularly where there's systemic disparities and also there's concerns around trauma and oppression. So it's thinking about the reality of racial inequality also within children's services and adoption services and the impact of that for children. So that active consideration will then be able to understand, to help adoptive parents, I think, to think about what they need in the long term. So with that consciousness, we argue, that comes with an element of intentionality, which is the second model within the framework, the racial and cultural intentionality. So the difference is that one is about consciousness, awareness of one's identity and being reflective of that. And intentionality is about preventing the racial trauma, preventing the narratives that we've heard, preventing concerns about adoptive parents saying, we didn't know what to do, we didn't have an understanding, preventing the racial trauma in relation to children, and preventing cultural and racial erasure and imposterism that we've heard about today. But it's also about being intentional and considerate and quite purposeful in terms of the support that is required, whether it's education and equipping adoptive parents with the skills that they need to provide what is needed for children, as well as moving beyond superficial provision of support. So the AFDiT framework is developed within relevant principles, really. So I'm just going to provide these principles at a glance. So first, if we remember what we heard from practitioners around limited information about identity, what we're saying is that we need practitioners to think about providing comprehensive information about identity, comprehensive information about their family and their history and their culture, thinking about exploring any gaps in information within the child's file, and also thinking about providing fuller information around children's cultural roots, as well as religion, not forgetting that, because also that is something that is of concern. Then thinking about preserving that. We're also arguing that we know that within the adoption system that most of the information that is provided within the child permanency record is probably information that social workers and children's services would have collated. And it's being aware that there may be some gaps, but not necessarily closing the door to having conversations with birth parents. So one principle here is really thinking about having collaborative partnerships and including birth parents within the approach, but at the same time, having close collaborations with community networks that help us to understand identity and cultures that we're not always aware of or familiar with. Then, of course, the prevention of racial trauma. So when we devised the framework, it was really thinking about we can use the AFDiT framework for assessments of prospective adopters, but also thinking about matching at the same time. But the framework, of course, is grounded in the concept that we spoke about. So if we think about power and privilege, the recommendation is that in all decisions being made, we need to be thinking about social workers' power, privilege, and any bias that might be associated with that, but also thinking about these elements in respect of any decision makers and prospective adopters and supporting them to be aware of this and eliminating this in decision-making processes. Then, of course, we mentioned about collaboration with birth parents, and I think this is an important decision-making value that enables us to see gaps and to see the value of going back to their parents to be able to obtain information where there are gaps. And I think some of the questions that I'm aware of is that, what if it's a relinquished child? What if there's no information about paternity? I think there could be some discussions that would be had around that, where there's information and connections with the family. There might be room to be able to go back. Where that mother is still involved, there might be room to go back as well to collect some of that information, to be able to fill in the gaps within the information that we might have in respect of the child's identity. Then the recording of that information in much more detail with clearer nuances that moves away from just one line that explains the child's identity or two words without some clarity. Then again, the cultivation of connection across difference, which we spoke about in terms of curation of identity and integration, thinking about what is required in terms of providing support, and it's about future-proofing the support that is needed, and thinking about integration there and making recommendations that will be helpful for the adoptive family. Then race trauma, thinking about that, thinking about trauma, but thinking about the reality of racial trauma and being relationship-based in our approach. And then identity affirmation, I think this is an important one in relation to some of the things that we're talking about, and all those lived experience rotations that we spoke about clearly identified the lack of identity affirmation. So that being an important decision value for decision makers and practitioners. So I think a question that always comes up is, what does count as transracial adoption? It's not black and white. And of course, when we started conducting this research, we were thinking about Black children and issues and concerns in relation to the disparities that we spoke about. They remain longer in the system, and needing to address some of those concerns around Black children's needs. But it's not black and white. We're not just thinking about children who are Black or Asian moving in white families. What we're talking about are differences in ethnicity, differences in culture, differences in ethnic backgrounds, and difference in religion as well. So all that we've encapsulated as our definition of transracial adoption. So it might be a white child moving in a Roma Gypsy family. They might have similar looks or similar skin color, but they might be different races and different cultures that we need to think about. So that's a good example. And another example, it might be an African child moving in a Caribbean family as well. There will be differences there, and maybe different religious differences. So that's what we're talking about. Having said that, the principles around anti-racist practice remain grounded to the tool, but we also know the tool is no longer just being used for adoption only, for transracial adoption only. We know that this tool is now being used across all children because of how helpful it has become in terms of understanding children's identity, whatever their background might be. So it's also helping us to think about children's long-term identity, but also thinking about having clear and open discussions where there might be obvious differences in children and adopted parents' identities. We also know that it's used for fostering, so it's not just adoption, because we need to think about the child's journey from fostering through to adoption. So the framework is relevant there as well. So I now want to talk about the framework so that we can have a bit of an understanding. And I'm also mindful that we do have practitioners who are with us and colleagues coming from practice as well. So I'll try and explain it as slow and carefully as I can within the time that I have. So I have considered that as well. So what we have here is just really thinking about the child's sense of self really being at the core of our practice and the core of this framework. And we've got two layers that we need to think about. So the outer layer, we argue those are emotional and sensory elements of the framework that particularly support us in thinking about what the child requires. So what we see on the outer layer here, just thinking people online. So you have words like familiarity, reassurance, immersion, comfortability, predictability, belonging, embodiment, feelings, seeing and observing. So the argument is that we know that if a child is within their birth family, they're likely and highly likely to feel reassured about all these elements here that we have inside the will. They'll feel reassured about the religion, race, and ethnicity. They're likely to have a good understanding, the elements of immersion, comfortability, predictability. So routines around religion, ethnic care. There'll be certainty about what's my diet supposed to look like. There's embodiment, feelings and smells in relation to all these elements in the inner circle here of the will. But I'll give some examples as we carry on. So the argument is that if any of these somehow drop, we're likely to have a risk of racial trauma because a child might have a lack of understanding, for example, about their race and ethnicity, about their diet, about their ethnic care, for example. And if they're not familiar with their heritage, there's going to be questions about who are they, and they'll have limited understanding of who they are. I think there's a good example around thinking about what happened with George Floyd and linking which almost correlated with when we're undertaking this research. We know most transracially adopted people were seeking to understand what is my heritage, what is my history, who am I? So there's questions about, do we need to be undertaking DNA tests to help adoptive children understand their history? Others who had done their DNA test, they then understood, oh my goodness, there's a history of slavery in my identity. I didn't really know, and all that was a culture shock for them. So all this, I suppose, it's about understanding that. And if we don't understand that in adoption, that might be information that birth parents might understand and provide familiarity, education, and certainty in terms of understanding. So the request, I suppose, with this framework is that we would want this to carry on. And if we have this information, that can be supported through fostering and through to adoption as well. So this is how the AFDiT framework may guide practice. And we know that already in social work, there is an understanding of the AFDiT framework now within pre-proceedings. There's conversations with social workers who are writing their CPRs, BUZWA has included now the AFDiT framework within the CPR, the child permanency records. I've just remembered that. I might need to explain that. So that's the child permanency records. So it's now embedded within that, which allows social workers to really think about all these elements around the child's identity as they're going through fostering and adoption, and maybe some of the discussions around how to include that within care proceedings as social workers are looking for placement orders. So it helps to inform detailed recording, identity outcomes, and also it's also about thinking about how to include this framework in early discussions around adoption in relation to the child, and also when we're speaking with prospective adopters, to start those conversations early rather than later on within the adoption process, including early inquiries. So thinking about strategies for support and evaluating capacity to adopt transracially, capacity to provide adequate support, and to provide strategies that support racial and cultural socialization. In addition to that, it's also about assessing willingness to engage in ongoing education about the child's heritage and identity, but also thinking about the needs for therapeutic support in relation to identity, but also intersectionally with the child's additional needs that are important to think about. So it's a guide for decision making. We also know that the AFDiT framework is also being used in supervision. It's also now being used by independent reviewing officers, that's the IRO, but also and guardians as well in supporting and thinking about decisions in relation to the child and where the gaps may be and what needs to be included in the child's report, for example. We also know it's being used in special guardianship as well, but I will come to that later on, and kinship care. So AFDiT is also a tool for reflection. So with the work that we've been doing and that we're continuing to do as social workers, it's encouraging social workers to use this framework to think about their own identities as well. before they even think about working with adoptive parents. So it's a tool for reflection that allows social workers to think about their own identities, their own elements of privilege, and helping adoptive parents to think about what do we need to be doing in respect of the child, and moving around the wheel to think specifically around the child's needs and explain what the child requires, both to foster carers and adoptive parents. The tool is quite big, so I wouldn't be able to include all the questions here in my talk, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of questions that I included within the framework. So there are just two questions here that I've included. One, which is about strategies, probes social workers to think about strategies, asking adoptive parents what might be the strategies that you might use to employ you to have a better understanding of your own privilege, to have a better understanding of the child's identity in regards to their race, ethnicity, and culture, including religion. What strategies might you put in place to promote a sense of belonging, but also to think about provision of space to talk about discrimination and racism, and also strategies to promote long-term racial and cultural socialization. So I've included a question here around social networks, which is really important. I think, how would you ensure that you're going to provide the right support for the child in terms of social networks? And in the framework is thinking about permanent social networks rather than temporary or tick box. And it's really about thinking about avoiding what, this is a quotation, what somebody mentioned, this lip service, being able to look really carefully, and that it's not a tick box process as well. Okay, so just a couple of examples here. So what I wanted to do is to just give a couple of examples in terms of reassurance, what that might mean in terms of the framework and asking questions. So the reassurance, which we have on the wheel here, and security, is asking adoptive parents, what might you put in place for a child to create a safe and open space to ensure that they experience emotional safety in regards to their identity, to address stereotypes around their religion, and also to think about racism within the family and outside. So things like the microaggressions around the racist uncle, for example, and what might be done in terms of supporting them and allowing the child to feel a sense of safety in relation to talking about that and talking about their concerns there. Then another example here is in relation to comfort and naturalness, and thinking about inclusion of decor within the home environment, making sure that the child's identity and racial identity, in fact, is not different, it's not unfamiliar to them, and that they're able to see that their identity and cultural heritage is also interwoven within all elements of their lifestyle within the home. Some examples here around books and media and what children might be watching on the television, for example, in the choice of films and cartoons for children. And in terms of observing and seeing, it might be about how the family might act and behave. And maybe it might also be about taking a child elsewhere. And it might be about visiting their country of origin, for example, or where the family comes from, for example, to understand prayer mats, maybe, for example, that might be helpful in terms of supporting the child to carry on with some of the cultural and religious rituals and routines as well. So these are some of the examples in terms of how this might be considered. And I think if we want to think about the Welsh context, you might think about a child who might come from, whose heritage is from Tanzania, for example, and they also have a Welsh heritage as well. So it's thinking about how do you bring the two, and if that child then is in foster care across the bridge in Bristol, how do you ensure that those elements of their identity are included and supported where there's a mixed number of heritage and identities, so that they understand and they have a good sense of understanding of who they are and elements of their identity. So the will was one element of the framework. And then you've got a second element of the framework here. I'm hoping you can see it, and if not, it's very clear on the transracial adoption framework, which you're welcome to to download. And I just want to explain this. So this is a scale which is rated from 0 to 4. So 0 being evasive, and 4, that's the highest level of integration. And I will explain to this shortly. So what you have above here is the race and cultural consciousness, and at the bottom is the race intentionality. So I'll just bear with me, and I'll just come to this here to just explain this. So what you have, if you think about race and cultural consciousness, we talk about consciousness, we spoke about awareness of identity, didn't we? So what you have is probably an example of somebody saying, we don't see color, I don't see color. So that means there's very minimal understanding of identity there and identity differences. So they're dismissing the need to see the child's identity, child's heritage. And then level 1 is about appreciation, and they might have a low level of understanding of differences in identity, but perhaps they're not necessarily confident and they have minimum exposure to diversity. And then level 2 is superficial engagement and understanding around identity and differences. Then level 3 and 4, you'll be able to clearly see active engagement of engagement with diversity, the child's culture, having a clear understanding of consciousness, having a clear understanding of racial trauma, for example, and that they're prepared to avoid racial trauma. And level 4 is the highest level of consciousness where they're able to integrate and everything is part and parcel of the child's everyday. Like what we know from adoptive families who we have worked with in this work, they argue that even though somebody is at the highest level, it doesn't mean that they can stop learning. So I think that's an important insight there from them as well. And then the bottom of this scale here was intentionality, which I would like now to explain what that means. So if we think about intentionality, so if we know that somebody is evasive, they're not going to necessarily be intentional in actively providing for what the child requires in terms of their heritage and their identity. And what you also see here, level 1 is superficial attempts to provide for the child's identity, to understand what they require, and maybe they'll be inconsistent in providing for the child in respect of that racial, cultural socialization. The child is not exposed to their culture, or they are very inconsistently and at a very low level. So level 2 will be very basic. What you then have is level 3, which is the higher level where you see genuine integration. There's decor within the home environment. They're being exposed to language. And then again, you've got the highest level, which is number 4, where there's clear understanding of microaggressions, racism, there's space to talk about this, and they can clearly apply the strategies that are required to provide support for the child. So within the framework, so what we recommend is that they do the assessments separately. So the racial consciousness assessment and the race intentionality, and then they can make decisions here and make recommendations. What we know in terms of evidence is that some practitioners are saying when they begin to work with adoptive parents and provide recommendations, they're moving up the scale. So there's evidence that the support and education they're provided is working and that the scale is having an impact. Social workers are beginning to have those conversations now. So these are some of the areas where the AFDiT framework has been. I'm just thinking about some of the practitioners in the room where the framework has been applied in practice. So pre-permanency, matching processes in life story work, post-adoption support, matching. We also know that it's being used in fostering kinships and special guardianship as well. So it's now relevant in thinking about identities in that way. So I've alluded to some of the findings from the evaluation. So across England, we're running a Champions program. We've had about 58 social workers signing up to the Champions program to implement the framework. And we're providing reflective sessions to support them with any questions around around implementation, how to do that, and providing some clarity around how to apply the framework. We know that it's now included in the child permanency record. It's also now going to be included in the prospective adopter records as well, to help adoptive parents to understand their identities, and in the records that all identity elements are much more comprehensive and detailed, both for the child and adoptive parents. So evidence is showing that there's greater understanding of the importance of understanding the impact of racial trauma, the importance of racial and cultural socialization. We know that there's now enhanced training around transracial adoption in terms of preparing adoptive parents, in terms of preparing panel to make decisions around transracial adoption, whether it's messaging or it's approval panels for prospective adopters. So the framework is giving social workers some confidence to talk about identity issues and to talk confidently about the impact of transracial adoption when it's not done right. And we know that there's improved writing around children's identity. So we're no longer seeing single sentences explaining children's identity. So this is my last slide. I think in terms of just bearing in mind, I'm not coming from research in the Welsh context, but I think what will be helpful within the Welsh context is thinking about the overrepresentation of, which is similar to England, of Black Caribbean mixed race ethnic groups in Wales. We know that there's a concern around that. We also know that there's issues and concerns about Roma Gypsy travelers experiencing additional barriers around belonging and identity. And it's thinking about how do we support the aspects around belonging for children who might come from these backgrounds, but at the same time understanding the Welsh society as well and their Welsh identity, reducing the risks of identity loss, identity erasure, affirming ethnic identities, affirming ethnic language. I think it's also about remembering the Welsh language, because we know historically the Welsh language is something that has lost its way due to economic oppression. We know that. And we also know that from research, you might correct me if we're wrong, 6.5%, I understand, of children are placed outside of Wales. And that is important in terms of allowing those children, wherever they are placed, to understand their Welsh context, their Welsh identity, and their heritage, thinking about language and community. So in the same way that we're thinking about Black and Asian minority children who are adopted transracially, I think the framework is relevant to think about Welsh children who are being placed in families that are not of Welsh identities, and to prevent the risk of their identities being lost in those families, and promoting identity confidence and also pride in the Welsh culture and Welsh identity and heritage in that way. So these are just some examples of how this could be applied in practice. So thinking about what might be applied in terms of the home environment to promote pride, the birth language, identity formation, different strategies that might be useful to support understanding identity formation, as well as helping children to integrate within communities, as well as to integrate their culture in adopted families as well. So that was my last slide with some of these examples to think about the Welsh context, and I'm not sure whether we've got time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Tam. That was fantastic and really engaging and thought-provoking talk. Has anybody got any questions? We've got about 10, 15 minutes. I think we can spare some questions. Give some time for them to come online as well, if anybody types.
Thanks, Tam. That was an incredible talk, and I think I probably speak for everyone so much. We appreciate you thinking about how this connects with Wales and the work we do in Wales. So thank you for those comments. I'm wondering if you have any input to social work training and post-qualification training, because I feel like there's value here in getting in early with the profession and just starting to have those conversations. If that's needed, that's on.
Yeah, post-qualifying training. So we're thinking about social workers and training about, so at Sussex we offer CPDs. So and I wonder whether this is something, and we do our CPDs online actually, so this might be something that we can roll out. Just contact us at Sussex and we'll be able to do that. We provide CPD sessions on transracial. Actually, I do it based on some of this work and thinking about transracial adoption and the framework. So that would be helpful for post-qualified social workers. It's not a specific module as such, but there's CPD sessions that we run in our CPD hub to support social workers to think about this. There's different topics, but certainly this one is one of them as well. And I think that links in with some of the challenges that we identified in our work around lack of confidence to talk about identity, what we really need to think about. And some of these strategies here we have. You'll be surprised when having conversation, thinking, oh, actually, we hadn't thought about that. We hadn't really thought about that. And it might be simple things like, where do you get resources for children to maintain their hair, to maintain their skin? Where do you buy food? I'm thinking about families who might be in remote areas. I lived in Cardiff and it wasn't very diverse. I had to come into London or whatever areas to find what I needed in terms of culture. So I think that will be the same for children, might be in those areas as well, and helping social workers to think outside of the box, I think. So.
We do have some more information, an observation from one of our participants online, Helen, who has said in regards to the Wales process and template, the AFDiT framework is being included in the newly reviewed CARB pilot, which is starting soon, and in the adoption policies and skills framework. So it sounds like it will be included in a Welsh context as well in this new pilot, which is great.
It will be, and I have spoken with Jane, and I'll be looking to translate the will in the Welsh language, so hopefully we'll get that right. So it will come out, and if we get the translation wrong, just let us know. But yeah, I'm working with Cora and Buff to support that.
Hey, thanks, I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed particularly thinking about how the reciprocal process of how it's just about the family sort of adapting to include aspects of the child's heritage, but also changing their own heritage as a family. So I really thought that was really interesting. It made me think about how we make and remake our identity throughout our lives. And I was thinking as well about Dr Cane, the poet, and how she's talked she's written so powerfully about how she has remade her. Who's transracially adopted the name doesn't know what you should read it, but how she's remade her identity as a Scottish African gay woman over the years and over decades. And I just wondered how much so the adoptive parents will also be changing their heritage and culture and identity as part of this process, hopefully. And I was wondering how much in your framework you help both practitioners, but particularly doctors, think about this is a lifelong project rather than something you do once.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what the framework is about, to say this is a long-term impact, and thinking about lifelong at the back of the framework. There are examples of what needs to be put in place in terms of strategies across different age groups, if you like. So just thinking about that and the impact of that deprivation in relation to racial trauma across different age groups. So what we suggest in the framework is that this is a long term, so you need to be thinking about it in the long term and not just the here and now, but what do you need to put in place? And carrying on as the child develops, being prepared about what else do you need to put in place to support the provision of understanding of the child's identity. And of course, we made some recommendations on therapeutic support. I think I mentioned that in terms of that. So it's not just about when children are younger, it's thinking about actually the long-term outcomes.
Wow.
Thank you so much for your talk and
Thank you.
joining us. If we could give Tam another round of applause.